Rachmanism vs. Housing Associations. The history of housing in the United Kingdom has been marked by both innovation and infamy. One of the most notorious chapters in this history is the era of Rachmanism, a term derived from Peter Rachman, a landlord who became infamous in the 1950s and 1960s for exploitative practices in the private rental sector. His name became synonymous with the ruthless pursuit of profit through the intimidation and displacement of tenants, often targeting vulnerable populations. Conversely, housing associations were established to offer a socially responsible alternative to both private landlords and state housing. They were designed to provide affordable, secure, and decent housing to those in need, playing a pivotal role in the UK's social housing framework. However, as the housing landscape has evolved, concerns have emerged regarding the conduct and direction of housing associations. Financial pressures, regulatory changes, and shifts in government policy have led to practices within some housing associations that bear uncomfortable resemblances to the exploitative tactics associated with Rachmanism. This essay explores these similarities by comparing Rachmanism and the contemporary business and operating models of UK housing associations across several key dimensions: tenant treatment, financial strategy, regulatory oversight, impact on vulnerable populations, and mission evolution. Through this comparative analysis, we aim to assess the extent to which housing associations have diverged from their original purpose and whether elements of Rachmanism persist in modern housing provision. Tenant treatment and security. Rachmanism was characterized by a flagrant disregard for tenant welfare. Peter Rachman capitalized on the housing shortages of post-war Britain by acquiring properties with sitting tenants and employing aggressive tactics, including harassment and neglect of maintenance, to drive them out. These properties were then relet at significantly higher rents to new tenants, often immigrants or other vulnerable individuals who had limited housing options and limited legal protections. In contrast, housing associations were intended to serve as sanctuaries from such exploitative conditions. They offered long-term security of tenure, often with assured or secure tenancy agreements, which provided tenants with stability and peace of mind. However, over the past 2 decades, many housing associations have shifted towards the use of fixed-term tenancies, sometimes lasting as little as 2 or 5 years. This shift was partially a response to government policy encouraging tenure flexibility and the better management of housing stock. This evolution has led to increased insecurity among tenants, particularly those on low incomes or with complex needs. The use of short-term tenancies can create a revolving door system that undermines community cohesion and tenant well-being, echoing the instability tenants experienced under Rachmanism. Although not driven by malice, this insecurity is a byproduct of strategic decisions that prioritize asset management over tenant stability. Financial strategies and profit orientation. Rachmanism was inherently profit-driven. Peter Rachman operated on a model that sought to maximize income through minimal expenditure, often neglecting repairs and essential services. His focus was not on housing as a social good but as a vehicle for financial enrichment, exploiting gaps in legislation and the desperation of tenants. While housing associations are legally non-profit entities, many have adopted business models that mirror profit-oriented behavior. Since the reduction of direct government grants for social housing development, housing associations have increasingly turned to private finance and cross-subsidy models. This involves developing homes for outright sale or market rent to generate income that can then be used to fund affordable housing. Although this strategy ensures continued investment in housing stock, it also introduces commercial pressures that can distort priorities. The emphasis on development targets, income generation, and financial viability sometimes comes at the cost of tenant services. There have been cases where maintenance is delayed, tenant concerns are overlooked, or social housing is sold off to finance new developments. Such practices raise questions about the balance between financial sustainability and social responsibility, and whether some housing associations are drifting towards a Rachman-like focus on revenue over residents. Regulatory oversight and accountability. One of the key enablers of Rachmanism was the lack of effective regulatory oversight. At the time, tenant protections were minimal, and local authorities lacked the power or will to intervene. This allowed landlords like Rachman to operate with impunity, exploiting legal loopholes and evading scrutiny. Today, housing associations are subject to regulation by the Regulator of Social Housing, RSH, in England, and equivalent bodies in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. These regulators oversee governance, financial viability, and, to some extent, consumer standards. However, critics argue that the regulatory framework is insufficiently robust when it comes to enforcing tenant rights and service standards. Reports of poor maintenance, inadequate responses to complaints, and limited tenant involvement suggest that some housing associations are not fully accountable to the people they serve. The Grenfell Tower tragedy brought national attention to issues of tenant voice and safety in social housing, prompting calls for stronger regulation and more meaningful tenant engagement. In some cases, tenants have reported feeling ignored or marginalized, echoing the powerlessness that was a hallmark of Rachman's victims. Impact on vulnerable populations. Rachmanism was particularly damaging to vulnerable groups. Immigrants, low-income families, and people with limited English proficiency were among those most likely to be exploited. These individuals had few alternatives and were often unaware of their rights or unable to enforce them. Housing associations were created to support precisely these groups, offering housing that was both affordable and supportive. Yet, recent trends indicate that some vulnerable populations are again being marginalized. For example, the introduction of affordability assessments for prospective tenants has led to cases where individuals in receipt of benefits are deemed financially ineligible for social housing. Furthermore, the shift towards fixed-term tenancies and the prioritization of working families in allocation policies have been criticized for sidelining those with the greatest needs. This shift may be unintentional, but its effects resonate with the exclusionary dynamics of Rachmanism. When policies disproportionately disadvantage the vulnerable, the ethical distinction between Rachmanism and modern housing management begins to blur. Mission evolution and organizational drift. Peter Rachman operated with no pretense of a social mission. His approach was transactional and self-serving, rooted in a view of housing as a commodity rather than a right. Housing associations, by contrast, were founded on a commitment to social justice and community development. Their missions typically emphasize values such as inclusivity, support, affordability, and empowerment. However, the evolution of their business models has raised concerns about mission drift, a departure from these founding principles in favor of commercial imperatives. This drift is partly a response to external pressures, funding cuts, increased demand, and complex regulatory requirements. But it also reflects internal choices about organizational priorities and culture. As housing associations grow larger and more corporate in structure, there is a risk that decision-making becomes detached from tenant realities. Board compositions increasingly include individuals with finance and development backgrounds, sometimes at the expense of those with lived experience or community insight. Such transformations can erode the ethos that once set housing associations apart from private landlords. While they may not replicate Rachman's overt abuses, the systemic effects of mission drift can lead to outcomes that are similarly detrimental to tenant welfare. Conclusion. Rachmanism remains a cautionary tale of what can happen when housing is treated purely as a profit-generating enterprise, devoid of ethical or social considerations. Housing associations were established as a corrective to such abuses, offering a model grounded in compassion, community, and fairness. Yet, as this analysis has shown, certain aspects of the contemporary housing association sector echo the dynamics of Rachmanism. These include diminished tenant security, financially driven decision-making, inadequate regulatory enforcement, marginalization of vulnerable groups, and the erosion of social purpose. While these similarities are more structural than intentional, they nonetheless warrant critical reflection. To reclaim their role as stewards of social housing, housing associations must reaffirm their commitment to tenant welfare and democratic accountability. This means resisting the pressures of commercialization where they conflict with social goals, strengthening tenant voice, and ensuring that operational models align with foundational values. Only by doing so can they truly distinguish themselves from the exploitative legacy of Rachmanism and restore public trust in their mission.